You're listening to episode 73 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the podcast and website for modern, secular application of early Buddhist thought. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the companion website has show notes for each episode, along with resource materials on Buddhism, critical thinking, science, secularism, and skeptical thought. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Dr. Cathy Kerr joins us to speak about her recent study on the effects of mindfulness meditation training on anticipatory alpha modulation in primary somatosensory cortex. Hi everyone. Today with this episode, as with many others, I learned something. Only this time it was very unexpected and helped me assess my own attitudes about the placebo effect. In our culture, we can have this aversion to placebo effect, dismissing it because it does not show actual repair of damaged tissue. And it doesn't. But that doesn't mean it has no usefulness. In particular, with how we interact with our experiences of pain. As our guest today describes, we have some indication that this is not merely a perception, but that there are brain mechanisms which lessen the focus of our attention spotlight, resulting in what we have called placebo. And with this possibility, we open the door to intentionally practicing this refocus. We also speak about the impact of this naturalistic approach to meditation as becoming more available to a broad range of people. Dr. Cathy Kerr got her BA from Amherst College and her PhD from Johns Hopkins. She's been a lecturer at Harvard University and recently has become an assistant professor at the Department of Family Medicine at Brown University School of Medicine. So sit back, relax, and have a nice latte with a shot of macadamia nut. And our guest today is Dr. Cathy Kerr, Lab Director of the OSHA Research Center at Harvard Medical School. Cathy, good morning. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you. Just a quick correction. I'm actually heading to Brown University.
That's right.
So,
you're switching.
I'm transitioning away from Harvard, and I'm going to be the Director of Translational Neuroscience for the Contemplative Studies Initiative there.
Congratulations.
So, yeah, no, it's very exciting. It's exciting. Brown is really becoming kind of an epicenter for this type of work. There are a number of us that are focused on meditation and other topics down there. So
in fact, let's talk more about that. I'll make a note about that to ask about that when we get to a point. But let's start with having you tell us about your background.
Sure. So I was originally trained as historian and social scientist at Johns Hopkins University. That's where I got my PhD. And so I was at Harvard, and I developed this interest in healing and what, people with difficult illnesses, how they cope and why they might report, finding meditation helpful. And with that work, I actually connected up with a scientific group studying healing, studying the placebo effect in healing. And I helped design, working with Ted Kapchuk at Harvard Medical School, I helped design several clinical trials looking at the placebo effect and how to sort of modulate the placebo effect in illnesses like chronic pain and IBS, irritable bowel syndrome. And we ran several large trials, and we demonstrated these are the first sort of scientific prospective tests of different placebo effects in any format since the 1960s. And so what we looked at was we compared the effect of a placebo needle and a placebo pill. And we found that a placebo needle was more effective for chronic pain. And then we looked at what happens when you have a very warm manner by a practitioner versus a neutral manner. And we found that patients with IBS did better when they were treated warmly and very personally. Now, these may sound like sort of no-duh type results, but actually they'd never been demonstrated empirically before. And what it led me to take an interest in was something like placebo acupuncture it's actually a really powerful treatment, it turns out. And it's basically placebo needles that sit on top of the skin. And the people who receive the treatment don't know that they're not receiving real acupuncture needles.
Real acupuncture. Yeah,
yeah.
We've discussed this in the skeptical community because that study came out, and on the skeptical side, what they were, of course, touting is that, okay, so this shows that acupuncture is no more effective than placebo, and what we really need are studies on placebo because that is where we're seeing it. And
yes, I agree with you. It's an interesting. There's another way to look at it, though, which is we actually used acupuncturists in our trial to create these sort of warm kind of healing effects. And we talked to physicians about it because we were thinking about trying to do the same thing with physicians. They didn't actually know how to do the warm encounter.
It's not something that you're trained with, yeah.
Yeah, and so there is something that acupuncturists know how to do. And they know how to get a positive outcome that is the result of their training. And so and it may not be the actual effect of the needling, but they do other things. And one of the things they do is they touch the patient. Another thing they do is they draw the patient's attention to various they modulate their somatosensory attention.
Mm-hmm.
And so we actually developed a framework for thinking about how this modulation of somatosensory attention might be healing. Because we actually, one of the things that's really interesting about placebo acupuncture is that people report a lot of really interesting somatosensory experiences, both around the needle and distal from the needle. And there's something about when you think you're being touched and you're kind of lying in a quiet setting that your mind actually starts to process somatosensory stimuli differently. And we think that might be important for conditions like chronic pain. But the reason it's relevant to meditation is that this gave us this sort of embodied somatosensory modulation hypothesis, which is that one thing that a wide range of practices and therapies might do is actually retrain your somatosensory attentional system. And so we started thinking about this in the context of placebo acupuncture or Reiki or something like that. But we realized those are really difficult to control, and you get all these practitioner effects. It's just very hard to study, actually. So we started thinking about. So I at this point, after working with Ted Kapchuk for a number of years, I began working with a neuroscientist at MIT who was very interested in this, named Christopher Moore, and with Chris Moore and I developed a framework for thinking about this sort of healing touch somatosensory modulation effect. And we thought where would be interesting to study this, and we just, sort of decided that mindfulness, where there's a big focus on attending to the breath and the sensations of the breath and body sensations, that would be a really interesting place to test our hypothesis. And it was extremely clinically relevant because it turns out mindfulness-based stress reduction is really effective in reducing distress across a number of different populations.
And has been studied for quite some time, too.
Yeah, and reducing distress is like the sort of one thing that's been found, but it's been found to help the immune system in people dealing with HIV. It's been found to modulate cortisol levels in people recovering from cancer, and it reduces distress in people dealing with MS. It's an incredibly, it's very powerful because it seems to improve quality of life in many different populations.
Yeah, it's interesting that you had mentioned IBS before, because I have some Google searches set up to bring me information on various things, and there's a study that was released recently on the effects of meditation on people with IBS, and that it is very helpful to them in regulation of their discomfort, and that it is something that is proving to be helpful in their treatment.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, one of the things, if you think about IBS or chronic pain, I mean, what's going on sort of fundamentally is this just terrible body experience. I mean, your body feels lousy. And, what are some of the neural substrates of that? Well, somatosensory attention is, seems like a likely candidate that is disrupted in those conditions. And so the fact that mindfulness-based stress reduction, does really help with IBS, that suggests that there may be this kind of common embodiment mechanism that, basically the way that you attend to your bodily experience is changing it with something like MBSR. That's mindfulness-based stress reduction. So that's what we decided to investigate, looking at whether the somatosensory attentional system is modulated in mindfulness-based stress reduction. And that that was sort of our opening hypothesis, but we then needed a sort of really good sort of mechanistic understanding of how to measure that. And so that's when we developed the alpha dynamics paradigm, Chris Moore and I. And we did that in collaboration with another colleague, Stephanie Jones, who's actually kind of a computational neuroscientist. She develops models of sort of neural interactions between the thalamus and the cortex. And it's a very detailed, biophysically realistic model of columns in the somatosensory cortex. And she actually had this idea about how alpha rhythms, would be a really good site to test our somatosensory attentional modulation hypothesis.
Now tell us about alpha rhythms. That's a new term to me, at least.
Well, alpha rhythms. The alpha rhythm was discovered by Berger in the 1920s, and it's really the original rhythm. It's the easiest rhythm to measure from the scalp, and so very early EEG experiments and measurements were focused on the alpha rhythm. It's basically, especially say in the visual areas of the brain, there's a constant pulsing taking place at the 8 to 13 times per second. And these it's sort of basically like increases and then decreases in electrical current that are happening rhythmically 8 to 13 times per second. And what happens, say, when you and these 8 to 13 times per second sort of pulsations are typically happening in sensory areas in the brain. So the hallmark area are the visual areas, and so if you the reason why alpha was a strong focus of neuroscientists starting in the 30s is that it was very easy to measure changes in the alpha rhythm under various conditions. So if you shut your eyes, the alpha rhythm in visual areas will actually, the height of the wave will increase. And for years, that was really regarded as just something that scientists call epiphenomenal. That is, it's just sort of like a kind of trace of some other. It wasn't a very interesting process. Basically, it was just, that area of the cortex, those visual areas are sort of shut off, and when that happens, this rhythm starts pulsing. So it wasn't regarded as having any mechanistic significance. And somebody calls it like the exhaust fume of cortical processes. So it's like you wouldn't, if you're studying cars, you wouldn't study the exhaust fume. You'd go like what's happening under the hood in the engine. So the alpha rhythm was just kind of, it was regarded as an interesting correlate of psychophysical processes, but it wasn't regarded as causing anything to happen. So, in the 1960s and 70s, actually a lot of meditation scientists used alpha. They looked at alpha as a correlate of meditation states. And there's a really famous set of studies in the 60s where they looked at Zen monks, and they found that their alpha rhythms pulsated much higher when they were recorded with EEG, that the alpha wave was much higher in Zen monks than it was in control subjects. But it wasn't really clear what this meant, and it turned out that actually you can kind of increase your alpha generally just by sitting and relaxing. So they didn't have very good control conditions, and so basically that line of research has mostly been abandoned because there just wasn't a very good understanding of why alpha would be interesting and what it meant. So, but in the last 10 years, there's been a revival of interest by scientists in the alpha rhythm, sort of apart from anything that anybody in the meditation science community has been doing. Because it turns out that if you vary your attentional focus, so let's say you're staring straight ahead, but you kind of know to pay attention to the right part of your visual field, the area in the brain representing that visual field, alpha will decrease. So basically, when you attend to something, when you direct your attentional spotlight to something, the area in the brain that represents that sensory field, that area, alpha will decrease. And it turns out to be pretty spatially specific. It's not this general, what Berger and others saw were these very general effects, but it turns out that actually alpha is you can use your attention to modulate alpha on a retinotopic level. And what that means is that you can actually kind of control your alpha rhythms just by changing the focus of your attention. So that was sort of the state of the art when we began our study in 2007. And since then, we've actually extended the findings in the visual system to the somatosensory system. So what we found was that normal people, when they were asked to attend to their finger or their toe, they could actually, based on their attentional focus, could actually change the alpha rhythms in their primary somatosensory cortex in the map of the finger. So in a 1 centimeter square area in primary somatosensory cortex. Now, primary somatosensory cortex is sometimes referred to as Penfield's homunculus. That's this. Are you familiar with that?
I in fact used the term homunculus just yesterday in recording the interview with Roland Griffiths. But tell the audience about.
Okay, yeah. So Penfield was a neuroscientist in Montreal, and he discovered when people were about to receive neurosurgery, their brains were open, and he would stimulate the brain. And he found that if you stimulate the strip right at the sort of front part of the parietal cortex, that you feel as if you're being touched on your body. So this is basically a map of the body surface, and it basically receives all the somatosensory inputs, all the tactile inputs from the body travel up into this, and are received and encoded in primary somatosensory cortex. And that's where the information about location and intensity are stored and sort of processed. So now we know that primary somatosensory cortex has a role in pain processing, although it's poorly understood. And we know, and what our group found out was that you can actually vary the intensity of the alpha rhythm in a highly topographically specific way, or let me revise that, in a functionally specific way. You can kind of use your mind to turn the alpha rhythm up or down in that map of the body in different body parts. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense, yes.
So that's what ordinary people were able to do, and that's what we found out, and we published that in 2010 in the Journal of Neuroscience. But we then set out to discover, well, what about if we train people in 8 weeks of meditation? And before I describe that, I should tell you a little bit about what we're discovering now about the alpha rhythm, or why we think it's important. Basically, what we think is that the alpha rhythm is the brain uses the alpha rhythm to subtly adjust the excitability of neurons in the sensory areas. So it's kind of like a tuning knob, a very subtle tuning knob that one major purpose we know for this of alpha is that it appears when the alpha rhythm becomes very strong, when the attention is used to make the alpha rhythm very strong, it makes those sensory areas less sensitive, less responsive to stimuli. So what, in effect, the cortex is doing, or this mechanism is doing, is it's taking irrelevant sensory areas offline. So, like right now, you may not need to pay attention to, the feeling of your back on the chair. So, what you've done, I would hypothesize, is you have actually the alpha rhythms representing those body surfaces are actually higher than they would be if, you expected someone to touch your back. And so by subtly adjusting the excitability of those neurons, you're actually kind of improving the signal-to-noise ratio across, in the sensory system generally, and you're also just making your cortex much more efficient. And that matters because it turns out people who are really good at taking their cortex offline, taking sensory areas offline when they're not relevant, and then putting them back online when they're relevant, people who are good at that are also good at working memory tasks. Because what we think, or what the emerging idea here is that when you engage in a working memory task, like let's say you have to just remember for a second a friend's phone number before you write it down. When you sort of store those digits, one of the things that you're actually doing is at the same time you're kind of lowering the volume on sensory areas slightly in order to facilitate that memory. Does that make sense?
It does. In fact, it ties in very well with one's experiences in meditation where you're focused, say, just on the breath, that your other sensory input, I like the way you phrased it, is sort of it's taken offline. When you're sitting in meditation, many of us have had this experience where the background noise, we don't hear it anymore. The physical sensations, we don't have those anymore. They're at least muted to some degree. And that we're focused just on that one object of the meditation, and in this case, the breath. And the advantage to that is, even just for people who are listening to the podcast right now, you're probably not aware of the sensation of your left foot.
Exactly.
Now you are.
Right.
And that kind of thing, it's really what we're doing in meditation, but we're practicing this as a skill that can be developed. And what you're studying is, and what's actually happening in the brain when we do that.
So yes, what you're doing when you're following your breath is you're actually training your attentional spotlight, and you're training it to be able to focus on relevant sensations and not focus on irrelevant sensations. And that being able to one thing that's interesting about the breath as an object of meditation is that it's very dynamic. So it's moving a lot. And so one of the things that you are learning to do is to kind of train the attentional spotlight in a kind of dynamic context where things are changing. Because, people talk a lot now about brain plasticity.
Right.
And that's obviously very important. But there's actually an even, I think, more revolutionary paradigm shift that we're entering into, which is brain dynamics.
Tell us about that. Say more about that, because the brain plasticity is what you're exactly right. We hear that all the time. And it's true. We are changing, say, areas of thickness of the brain is what your colleague Sarah Lazar's study about that we interviewed.
No, the brain plasticity work is very exciting, and it shows that, actually changes happen really quickly, much more quickly than we thought. But even before those changes happen, there's something that we do, which is we are dynamically adjusting our neurons to changing sensory motor contexts all the time. And the ability to dynamically respond to changing circumstances, changing contexts, is actually a hallmark of cortical dynamics, this ability to change the setting of your neurons depending on what the sort of behavioral situation is. In other words, are you about to enter a room where you know that there might be a mean dog on the left side of the room? That's going to change your sensory dynamics and your motor dynamics. Contrarily, if you are constantly alarmed and vigilant, then you're not going to be able to, it's going to be hard for you to control those dynamics and to take sensory regions offline when they're not relevant. So it's not like, basically you need to be able to control those settings and vary them depending on the circumstances and the demand. And what we think is that practices like meditation make that much easier, and they create just more dynamic systems so that the signal to noise ratio is much better. And we think that this sort of this kind of facilitating this more flexible global dynamics might be one of the ways that meditation reduces stress.
Mm-hmm. And we see this in meditation as we talk in meditating about it being a moment-by-moment practice. And what you're referring to here, to me, sounds very much like that, the concept that even before there are physical changes in the brain, that brain plasticity thing, we're changing the settings. We're learning to put our focus in a different spot. And even before we get good at that, in other words, the brain itself has changed to adjust to what we've been doing with the settings, we can still change the settings right now. We're able to do that.
Yes.
One of the wonderful things
in a moment-by-moment way. And that's really important for when something unexpected happens. How are you going to react? If you haven't been training that particular skill, then the plasticity training towards plasticity might not be the thing that you need. You need to be able to change the settings adaptively and to be able to react to unexpected stimuli and contexts. And I think that is what the old meditation teachers used to talk about, and you see it in like Taoist texts as well. So it's very interesting. But so what we did was we did a longitudinal study. We compared, we randomized our group into meditators versus a no practice control condition, and that's a real limitation of the study that we did. We did not have people doing an active control, and we can talk some more about that, why that might be a limitation later, but I'll just tell you a little bit more about the study. So basically what we did was we put people at the beginning of the study, before they started to meditate, we had them go into a special form of scanner, brain scanner, called a magnetoencephalography recording chamber. And basically what this is a series of superconducting sensors or magnetic detectors that were developed to record signals from very distant stars, but they actually are turned inward towards the brain to record the brain's faint magnetic field. And so it's the magnetoencephalography can only take place. These are sort of helium-cooled squid detectors, they're called, and they're kind of built into this thing that looks like a gigantic hairdryer, and it's really funky, actually. So basically, it's these squid detectors in this gigantic hairdryer are located in a copper-lined chamber, triple copper-lined chamber that has a door that's like a bank vault. And when you shut it, it's like it goes like this, these electronic switches. And then you have to warn people because it can kind of freak them out.
Yeah, this will not be stressful. Clang.
Right. So then they sit in the recording chamber, and then we have these really cool piezo sort of crystal, they're called bender plates. If you put a tiny amount of current through, or a specific amount of current through, they actually bend, and then they have a little tapper attached, and they very, very lightly, automatically touch either your finger or your toe. And so we had people sort of sitting in with their head in the hairdryer, staring at the screen, and then the screen would prompt them to report whether they had been touched on their foot or on their hand. So they would either pay attention to the foot or the hand. And then we had these piezo stimulators. We had a piezo stimulator on the finger and a piezo stimulator on the foot. And then it was just this automated paradigm where they would be asked the question where they touched on the hand or the foot, like I think they were asked that like 250 times in a scanning session. And then what we did was we analyzed the alpha rhythms, and we looked to see whether people could, change their alpha rhythm depending on whether they focused on their hand and their foot. And what we found was that after 8 weeks of meditation with mindfulness-based stress reduction, the mindfulness meditators were better at changing their alpha rhythms sooner and changing their alpha rhythms to a greater extent than the controls. They also were better than they were at the beginning.
Which is nice because you not only had a control of non-practitioners that had no training in the MBSR, but you also showed a change from beginning state.
Exactly, yes. And I mean, some people came in and they were actually kind of what you might call at ceiling. They were really good at this task to begin with, and you would expect that. About half the people who entered the study were kind of already very good. And what happened in the meditation group is that the people who weren't good got good. And so everyone at the end was good, whereas there wasn't really any change in the control group. And so, what there are a number of limitations to our study. We don't have what's called a behavioral correlate. We don't know if this meant that their fingers and toes were more sensitive, or if they were better at a finger or toe detection task. Because just the way that we did the paradigm, we had to there's sort of statistical reasons that we weren't able to test that.
Yeah.
And then the other limitation is that we didn't have the control group doing an active practice. So they may have gotten disengaged or apathetic by the end. I mean, their performance they didn't have a lot of false hits. Their performance was good, so they were clearly doing the task. But there may have been some subtle lack of motivation, given that they weren't in the meditation class. And then, obviously, our meditators were really loved the class and wanted to do well, and that may have given them some additional motivation to focus.
Right, right.
So, it's hard. We have to do a larger study with a more active control group in order to really tease these effects apart.
Well, it's always very difficult to control people because, unless you have them every moment of during trial closely monitored, of course there's going to be some natural variation in experience with the person's daily life over the course of several weeks of a study.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's another question. We asked them how often they meditated, and they did report that, but sometimes people aren't very accurate in their self-reports.
Right.
So
right.
That's another thing, is we didn't really, we weren't able to correlate it with the amount of practice that people did.
Well, it's like I'm reminded of a study that came out a few months ago, and I'm doing the Quoddy Air Fingers study about this fellow in I think in India who claimed that he didn't need to eat or drink at all, and they did a study of this guy in which he was not monitored at all. And
Are you kidding?
He would leave they did an X-ray of him, and there was substance in the bowels, and then he'd leave, and he'd come back the next day and say, "No, I didn't go to McDonald's or anything." It's like, wow, that's amazing! What a great study we've done.
That's what we call a pilot study. Then you have to kind of actually put those controls in place. Well, I was just going to say, I mean, we were pleased that we were able to do a randomized division of this sort of presumably equally motivated group of people into two groups. So that was one strength of our study, and that's not actually a lot of brain imaging studies don't use a randomized design, because it's actually really hard to do, because you kind of have to recruit people in waves, and that means you have to scan them all at the same time, which is if you're running hour-and-a-half scan sessions and you've got 16 to 20 people, it's just incredibly difficult.
Right, I would imagine rather expensive too.
Yeah, well, I mean that we did our study on the weekends and the evenings, so that was mitigated a little bit. But yeah, no, this is a very high intensity. I mean, one thing that we had to then clean the signals from these magnetic field readings, and had to filter it using special algorithms, and then we had to run these Fourier transforms on the data, and then we had to normalize it. It took us basically a year and a half of full-time technical labor by a person to transform the raw signal into data that we could publish. So it's just incredibly, and that was a pretty small study. So it's incredibly intensive, this type of processing, and it's very frustrating because since we can't do really large studies, it's hard for us to answer the most interesting or complex questions that people would want us to do.
It is very challenging, and one of the things that keeps coming up in discussions on the Facebook page and occasional emails that I get from people is wanting to see studies of comparisons between the different kinds of meditation that people do.
Yeah.
And I know there are some folks are starting to do that, and Roland Griffiths, in fact, is teaming with Richie Davidson on studies that are coming up. And so folks who are listening to this who are interested in studies of the brain, listen to those episodes as they come in, because it's interesting to me that a lot of these folks are working together, and it's a fairly, I think, fairly small community if the folks I'm reaching out to by random hits I'm getting from Google searches happen to be working together on these.
Right. Well, Sarah and I work closely together, and I've been to several meetings with Richie. So that's definitely, it's a very small and very, we all try to help each other with the research, because just some of the logistical demands are very, if you don't have help, you're not going to, it takes a village to do this research, I guess,
right.
is the way to put it.
One of the things I wanted to head back to, if we can revisit for a bit, is that the placebo we were talking about before is in particular, and this is one of the challenges that we face is many people took the study that we were talking about with acupuncture, folks who were not necessarily participating in that, instead of seeing it as the placebo effect is something that really warrants study, that what was important here was the interaction and what was happening with people's minds and what they were thinking was happening.
Right.
What many people took that as, though, and different acupuncturists were advertising this as, see, even fake acupuncture works, which that's not the case. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is...
Well, it's complicated, though, because
very complicated.
If you have a chronic pain condition, and you know that, I mean, I think that one of the things that is probably true is that acupuncturists are trained to be healers. That might not be a direct result of what they're doing with their needles.
Right.
But
yes, that's what we're saying. Yeah.
They seem to get good effects, when you look at the outcomes they produce. I mean, that was what we saw in the sham acupuncture study. These acupuncturists were actually very skilled at using the warm clinical encounter to generate really good outcomes. And so I think that if you think about it as an acupuncturist effect, not acupuncture, and you have a chronic pain condition, it makes sense that you might not care that much whether the needle punctures the skin or whatever. You just want that outcome. That's actually that might be a rational decision to go see an acupuncturist and get that therapy, whether you want to put the therapy in quotes or not, in order to achieve that outcome. I think that makes a lot of sense to me, given that except for things like pneumothorax I'm no longer an acupuncture researcher, and I don't really have I don't have a strong bias towards getting people to go get acupuncture. But I do think that the field has become very polarized. And what's been lost is that, what are the experiences that people find healing?
Right. Yes.
And, which is what you're saying too, I think. Yeah,
that is exactly what I'm saying. You're dead on with that. And it's a matter of how we perceive the experience we're going through and what that means to how we feel and how we feel in a mental way.
Right.
That is an area of study of, okay, so we see things happening with placebo that people do at least self-report, and we know that that's not a necessarily well-controlled thing. They self-report that they're feeling better, even when whether it's actual acupuncture or not actual acupuncture, we still see the same effects. Well, that's the effect. What's going on there?
Right.
And that's what you've been studying. And that's that intersection between a science of, someone making a claim of, if I stick a needle in you here, it cures your cancer. Not so. Versus if I do some form of interaction with you that makes your mental perception about what's going on in your body feel better.
But, Ted, it's not just mental perception. I mean, that's what we're trying to... Changing someone's somatosensory attentional system is not just working at the level of mental perception. It might be working at the way the somatosensory stimuli are organized.
Tell us more about that. Say more about that, because that's an important difference. You're right. Tell us more.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that people, our culture is just extremely, we tend to look at everything as mind versus body. And I do it myself. And it's a very natural thing. It's just the way our language is oriented. But, when we're talking about the fact that using mental attention, you can modulate the way somatosensory stimuli are encoded in primary somatosensory cortex. That's like a very, you're kind of reaching down into the somatosensory system, and you're doing it at a level that's lower than sort of the mental level. It's not at the level of mental experience. You're actually kind of reorganizing how the sensory system is organized in the primary cortex.
It's a biological process that you're.
It's a biological process, and it shows that the mental and the somatic physiology are very intertwined and are not, you can't just take a sword and kind of cut them apart. You're going to miss so much of what's going on, which is kind of in this gray area between kind of like mental attitudes and, you know, the basic physiology in touch or pain receptors. There's between the touch and pain receptors and the thoughts about the pain, there are many different levels of organization, and something like meditation or the placebo effect may kind of reach down into those very much lower levels than we thought and help to reorganize them. And that might be the insight that body workers and acupuncturists may be endowed with, that kind of, they may sort of, their system may have allowed them to reach down into that, into those early sensory areas, because they don't have the same biases that we have. They sort of working with a different mental map. That you know, if you talk to a meditator about their body experience, somebody who's been meditating a long time, a Zen meditator, they're going to talk to you about that in a different way. The way they think about it is different, and I think that's why I think that I'm sort of rambling here. Sorry,
No, this is exactly where I wanted to go, because what you're talking about, this is reflective of a conversation I was in last week with a friend who was asking about this, you know, mind body split that you and I have been chatting about, and I said, no, that's, you know, when I in my practice use the term mind, it's much more comprehensive. Right. This includes this sensory input. This is a totally, to me, a biological
embodied mind,
thing.
Right?
It's body mind. It's one. There's not a distinction between the two. And for him, it was one's thoughts is separate from the organ, the brain. And I'm like, no, that's all occurring in that same spot. This is all.
And your thoughts about your toe are going to affect how stimuli are encoded from the toe are encoded.
Right. So when I say perception, I'm inclusive of that whole biological process. There's no way to separate that. It's all dependent.
It's all yes. And what's, you know, if you go into early Buddhist texts, you see some interesting things. There are two things that I find really interesting. One is that, I mean, this is really strange. The Buddhist psychology, I can't remember the sutta where this is found, but Andy Olensky writes about this.
Yeah.
He, and I've seen this cited elsewhere, there are 6 senses.
Right.
Sight, sound, smell, touch, and thoughts. Thoughts are a sense. And, you know, from our perspective, you think about that, like, what on earth could that mean, thoughts are a sense? That is such a weird way of framing the senses. But what's interesting when you look at something like, one of the things that we're really interested in is whether being able to control your alpha dynamics means that you're better able to attend or disattend to your own thoughts. So, because one of the things we find is that people who are in distress, they get into what's called a rumination loop. They start to ruminate and they have these repetitive negative thoughts. And one of the ways that something like mindfulness might help people who are at risk for depression is you can actually learn to not pay attention to your negative thoughts. You can turn down the volume on your negative thoughts. And so we're really interested in, could these alpha dynamics that allow you to turn down the volume on the sensory system also allow you to turn down the volume on negative thoughts? And then that would be, in a way of operationalizing or thinking about the sixth sense theory. From the brain's perspective, some of the ways that thoughts are processed are similar to some of the ways that sensory stimuli are processed, or that there's some overlap there.
Absolutely, and I'm glad you brought up really two things. Andy Alinsky is someone that I've been honored to participate in a Buddhist ethics seminar with last year, and in his book Unlimiting Mind, he talks about that. Is the subtitle of that is The Radically Experiential Psychology of Buddhism, and I've quoted Andy's book many times in the podcast.
Great title.
And it's
wow.
terrific book, and it's talking about exactly that. And the other thing you brought up is in that whole the disengaging of the story, that papancha, that proliferation of thoughts about something.
Yeah.
I actually narrative therapy. Someone I spoke with some time ago, Walter Berra, is really focused on that. Is the helping people who are suffering this way. And it's not just narrative therapy. I think this is becoming more common, that it's helping people to not identify themselves with the story and being able to separate out from that and see and that initial insight into I'm not that leads to being able to disengage from that thing that is not me, leading to being able to let go of that thing that is wholly separate. And
that process is such a rich process. And the whole way the self is engaged. I'm sure you've probably. I haven't come up with a way to measure that directly, but I think that some of these brain dynamic processes actually sort of help facilitate that, and just training the attentional spotlight and learning how to modulate that. Actually, on sensory stimuli, they actually help you, as you say, learn to identify with your thoughts, and that in turn can loosen the hold that some aspects of the self have on us. And it's so the thing that's this fundamental insight that sensory processing is relevant to these so-called higher cognitive processes. That there are maybe some linkages. That's an insight that the early Buddhists had that I think has really been missing in our culture, and that's what we're alpha dynamics may be one way of sort of thinking about that, but more generally, what a lot of these sort of complementary and alternative modalities have been able to bring to the table is having that insight that sensory processing might be relevant for all sorts of different forms of distress. And I think that we, in some of our, I think that there was just maybe that information was lost in the Western tradition. And we're sort of having to, we think that there are some really basic brain mechanisms that, are, that learning how to focus and refocus on sensory stimuli could have huge implications for your mental health and for, helping you cope with distress.
Absolutely. And it's that suffering, and this is, it was a very nice segue that you brought in on the old Buddhist text, because one of the things we wanted to chat about a little bit is that this work that you're doing and that we're seeing more and more is becoming happily more inculcated into our Western contemporary culture, but it still has this a long history, a 2,500-year-old history of being associated with Buddhism. And I don't have a problem with that. That's fine. People resonate with practices that they are more inclined towards a faith-based tradition. That's okay. Right. Practice is still the same. Where we have something of a challenge, I think, is that people who are either in another tradition, they are devout Christians or Muslims or whatever, will not even look at this because, well, that's Buddhism, that's another religion, I can't do that. And I've participated in interfaith dialogues where that's the post hoc review of my participation in a talk about the intersection of meditation in Buddhist and Christian tradition is, oh, well, yes, but that's not Christianity, so we can't do that. because that's, and on one end it was because that's where Satan comes in.
Right.
And on the other side it was, yes, but I'm a good Christian and this comes from a different tradition, therefore I can't do it. And that's, to me, a problem that we need to overcome.
Right.
What we're seeing is this is something that we all as humans share the same basic biology with great variation, individuals of course, but that this is a human experience. This is something.
Well, I mean, I think that all the traditions have stumble on various forms of insight that become universally available, and I think that there's another Buddhist text that's also very interesting called The Four Foundations of Mindfulness, and that basically it describes a kind of development of insight and so-called enlightenment, that sort of thing. But what's really relevant, I think, are what are called the first two foundations. And basically what that text describes is that in order to be at home in the world, you need to first develop mindfulness of the body.
Yep.
And then develop mindfulness of the way that you react to the world and your preferences and what you like, and the fact that you're always noticing what you like or dislike. And then just develop mindfulness of your own thoughts, your thought process. And, the fact that came from some tradition from a long time ago, from somewhere far away, isn't what's relevant. What's relevant is that here are these three processes that are described. Let's empirically test them and see whether being aware of the body, being aware of the way that you react to the world, and being aware of what your own thought process is, does that actually help you negotiate your daily life better? And those practices are at the heart of mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is actually quite empirically validated to help people with incredibly difficult diseases.
Yeah.
People who are, caring for Alzheimer's patients, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that I've done several retreats at Bhavana Society with Bhante Gunaratna on the Satipatthana Sutta is what we're talking about here. Mm-hmm. And where that applied to me, because some people who are tuning in who are maybe new to the podcast, like, this is the secular Buddhist. You don't do that religion thing. Like, well, but to say that this is within a religious context, which is primarily where we find this today, secular practice is growing, and we see people like Andy Olensky that we're speaking with at Barry is taking that step towards. If you've ever done any seminars with Andy, he goes into the Pali Canon, but he doesn't do so in a way that is exclusive of anyone's faith tradition beliefs. And that's when we do these retreats and these practices, we can take them into whatever way we need to incorporate them with our lives, because they are still perfectly valid in that. Well,
I think that the reason I bring up something like mindfulness-based stress reduction is, this is to totally agree with what you're saying, that we've stripped away all of the religious or doctrinal aspects. It really is, if I learn to train my attentional spotlight on the breath and body sensations, if I learn to become aware of my repetitive negative thoughts, do I feel better?
Yeah.
And the answer, it turns out, is yes. And that the fact that emerged from that might have originally been a Buddhist insight really doesn't matter to the people who are in distress and are learning those practices. It's sort of like the golden rule is a terrific, do unto others as you would have others do unto you. Great principle. The fact that it originates in a particular tradition, it's still something that it would probably be useful for us to look at, more broadly. And I think that there's no learning how to focus on your breath and learning how to focus on body sensations and learning how to use that tool to learn how to focus on whether you have habitual negative thought patterns. There's no doctrinal content there.
right.
at all.
Right. It is value neutral in terms of doctrine. It is a matter of one's actual experience and what is useful.
And we think that there are really basic physiological reasons why engaging in those processes helps train your brain dynamics, makes you more adaptive to a broader range of situations, and, might make you feel better. And so, I think that these are really empirical questions, and we're beginning to get some answers now. We have some really promising hypotheses. But I think that these hypotheses are not based in any spiritual or faith tradition. They are just, what are the measurements that we're deriving in the brain? And does meditation change those measures?
And it makes a very big difference, because what we see in some folks who are very, shall we say, religion averse, will say, they will dismiss very valuable content because it comes from a religious background.
Right.
And what I keep saying is, so if E equals MC squared happened to have been founded by a priest of Catholic Church, would you dismiss that as not being valid?
Right.
I'm like, well, of course not. That's ridiculous. This is the same thing. It is still perfectly valid whether it was discovered by a religious figure we refer to as the Buddha in capital letters, or whether it was Martians, or whether it was a guy named Bob. It doesn't matter. It's the same thing.
It's true. Basically right now, that's what all of us in the mindfulness science community are testing these principles. And, it's not every hypothesis is going to be confirmed. Some of the ideas that people have are not going to, in larger studies, we're going to get some negative findings. And we need to be very open to the idea that some of our cherished hypotheses may not be true. That's what makes you scientific, is your willingness to admit when you're wrong, basically. So, and I think that's, down the road we're going to see, down the road we'll see negative studies for mindfulness-based stress reduction. We're going to see that it doesn't work for everything, that, it's not a, so I think that, people are going to have to keep that in mind.
And that's okay.
Exactly.
Science is, one of the nice things about science is it is self-corrective. It does say, this was an incorrect hypothesis. That's not how it works. That's not what the evidence shows us.
Right. And so I think that the broader point that our group is trying to make is that learning how to work with sensations, sensory stimuli, may have broader implications for your overall sense of well-being. And something like mindfulness may be a way to sort of train your brain dynamics to work with sensory stimuli more efficiently, and this might actually change the way that your sort of thought processes and your kind of view of the world work, and that might be something that somebody might consider undertaking, and especially people who are experiencing bodily discomfort, like IBS, chronic pain, that sort of thing, that they may learn that what something like mindfulness-based stress reduction may do is sort of take the attentional edge off of the chronic pain situation, so it's not intruding into your daily experience in the same way.
And those of us who do have chronic conditions which have a level of discomfort with them which is regular and above the normal levels, who are also meditators, often do see that as a benefit to it. Cathy, one of the things I wanted us to go back to that we started at the beginning of the conversation is about Brown becoming an episode.
Oh, yeah, right.
For study meditation. Tell us about that, because that's exciting.
Yeah, well, there's a kind of an embryonic group there that Hal Roth and Willoughby Britton are both have been there for a number of years. And Hal Roth is a really interesting guy. He's a really noted scholar of Taoism, but he's also somebody who is interested in contemplative education and what happens when people bring a kind of contemplative or meditative mind to the classroom, to a liberal arts classroom, or to medicine. And are there certain common themes that could be gathered into a kind of a faculty or a program where people can have a dialogue, scientists, scholars of religion, scholars of education, physicians, about what it might mean to be more contemplative in our approach to our subject matter. And so Hal is a sort of international leader in this. He set up a contemplative studies initiative, and he's basically been, he has a special intensive program for Brown undergraduates. He's helped to put in place, working with a number of really visionary people at the medical school, a contemplative sort of scholarly concentration for medical students in training for future physicians. So they can sort of learn about different contemplative traditions and how that might be relevant to their work as a physician. So Hal Roth has sort of put in place this really, I think, kind of visionary program, and he's been working more recently with somebody named Willoughby Britton. I'm not sure if you're familiar with her work. She also is an important meditation scientist. And she's done some really interesting stuff looking at what happens to the physiology of sleep when you undergo meditation training. And she's also looking at, this is a really interesting and important topic, and you might want to actually talk to her about this. Everybody's sort of looking at meditation as this very, very positive thing, but actually some people experience adverse effects from meditation, which you would expect because it's a very powerful experience. So any medicine that's powerful has to be used correctly. And so she started investigating adverse events resulting from meditation retreats. Very, very important topic.
And I've seen that sort of event happen on meditation retreats. Many of us who are regular meditators who do retreats have seen people have some problems, and this actually came up in a discussion at that interfaith dialogue on meditation, Buddhism, and Christianity, and the professor who was the Christian panelist on that said that a friend of his had this was the 60s, and he was he'd been taking a lot of drugs at the time.
Oh, well.
Had a very bad experience, and this guy was blaming meditation. And I said, well, yeah. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say maybe it was drugs he was taking at the time that might have contributed to that. But we still have seen people who, when you take a look at your thoughts, for the first time especially, you can be disturbed by what's actually going on in your mind all the time. That you just don't have that, as you said, that attentional spotlight on. You tend to tune that out. You ignore it. And so when you actually take a look at what's going on in the mind, that can call us up short, and that can be very upsetting to some people.
Yes, and I think that as meditation moves into the mainstream and it becomes, because it really is becoming an American practice, it's no longer needs to be looked at as this kind of foreign practice. It's people from all walks and all faiths are doing it. It's being recommended for medical conditions. As that mainstreaming happens, the fact that a very, very small number of people have these adverse events is something that we're going to have to focus more attention on to try to figure out what is causing that and who might be at risk for that type of event and what's the sort of best follow-up for those once that's happened. And Willoughby's actually is at the forefront of this and is really leading a major effort on that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down to Brown and I'm going to sort of help anchor their program down there. And actually Chris Moore, who is going to be coming down from MIT, he's starting a very high-level brain lab down there too. So we're going to actually continue our work together in cortical dynamics, and that will all be situated at Brown, and there are a couple of other people who are also doing this type of work. And so what we're hoping is that we're going to accumulate a kind of critical mass of interest among the students and the faculty, and production by Willoughby and me and Hal and others that will really make this kind of one of the preeminent programs in the country. And that's what we're trying to build up, and really solidify that the contemplative religious scholarship component is important into understanding the contexts where these practices take place, but the science is also important, and having that dialogue is really valuable.
Well, it is, because there's in the West we want to see the evidence. We want to know that this is validated by science, and that's what part of this effort is to show here's what's actually going on. It's not just self-reporting, yeah, I think I feel better. Mm-hmm. No, there's actual changes, and we can see what's happening, and that brings with it, within our culture, a certain degree of confidence in what's happening.
Yeah, I think that over the next 10 or 15 years, we're going to learn a lot more, and we're going to see some of the important studies are going to be replicated. I mean, I think Sarah Lazar's study of cortical thickness has now been replicated numerous times, and we'll really be able to have confidence that this is really something that's not just an occasional scientific finding, but it's really true, and it's probably true for me when I practice. Because, I mean, that's the other thing I want to say to people listening is that the science is all very young, and we don't want to, the studies are small. We don't want to overgeneralize from these studies too much, until we've really seen some validation, and people just need to sort of have that in mind as they read about these studies.
Yeah, we want to do it right, and
replication.
We want to see that this is, when we come out with a study and it shows this, that these are findings we can replicate.
Exactly.
And that's where really the validation comes in, because doing one study that shows one thing, we can make mistakes. We can have too small a group. Right. There can be just odd things that occurred, and replication of that study, that's what really shows it, because if it is a truism, if this is something we're actually seeing, we'll see it under
right.
a variety of times and different studies and so on.
Exactly. And I think that, I'm pretty confident. We are very optimistic about our ability to replicate our finding, but I think that, people need to just give the science a chance to grow and for these studies to be replicated. And I think, there's certain can be a certain overinvestment in these studies, I think, which is interesting in itself. But in order to be really scientifically minded, we need to look at them critically and think about what some possible confounds might be that might have that might challenge a positive interpretation.
Well, and as you said, we're very early in the development of this line of study, and we have tools that you were describing earlier that we didn't have 2,500 years ago. And so when people who are very pro-science say, but religion didn't find these things in their brain scans. Right. They weren't doing brain scans. Come on. And people who are very anti-science saying, well, but science hasn't figured out this, therefore, right. But bear in mind, it's very early yet. And religious contemplative practice has had thousands of years to come up with some ideas that are now bearing out as we see the intersection of those going forward.
Yeah, and it's very, very exciting. I think we're going to, over the next 10 to 15 years, we're going to learn a lot, and we're going to really, as these practices become more mainstream, people are going to, further hypotheses are going to develop that you and I couldn't even anticipate right now. I mean, maybe we'll talk 5 years from now, and there'll be some, really big advances that 10 years from now that we just wouldn't have thought of. And that's the scientific method moving forward.
Yep, that's it exactly. Cathy Kerr, soon to be assistant professor, Department of Family Medicine, Brown University School of Medicine. Did I get that right?
That's right, yes, and I'm going to be the Director of Translational Neuroscience with the Contemplative Studies Initiative.
Excellent. Thank you so much for spending the time with me, Cathy. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the companion website at www.thesecularbuddhist.com, and you'll find an entire web page devoted to this and every episode. There are also links to discussions about today's topic on the Secular Buddhist Facebook fan page. The music for the Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the Secular Buddhist on the About Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.